let's go over some general concepts of biogeography, which is the geography of life and living things. And it's, as geographers, what we look at rather is the distribution of plants and animals. Where are they located? Because geography is the spatial science, the science of where. We might also look at other things like patterns of what we call biodiversity, or the number of species in a place. So in this figure, you have these red colors like the Amazon basin has high biodiversity, where this desert environment in North Africa has low biodiversity. And we can divide up living things in different ways. The total collection of living things is called the biota. That's the combined plant and animal life. And we can divide that into flora, which are plants, and fauna, which are animals. And we can divide it other ways as well. We tend to look at terrestrial biota for things that live on land versus other living things that are in ocean environments. So terrestrial flora, or plant life, we can divide those up different ways. We can look at how they reproduce. That we have how they reproduce over time. That we have some that are perennial plants that live all year, and some that are annuals. And these die and leave seeds that will then sprout again the next year. And we can also look at the reproduction mechanism. These are two types of trees. These are conifer trees, also known as softwood trees, or these are hardwoods, or broadleaf or deciduous trees. And they have different methods of reproduction. The conifers, or what's known as gymnosperms, evolved earlier on in Earth's history and have a different seed mechanism than do these hardwoods or deciduous or broadleaf trees, which evolved later in Earth's history. So these fall under two different categories of plant life. So when we talk about vegetation in California, we may talk about coniferous forest that would be dominated by these conifers, or we might talk about broadleaf trees, or hardwood trees, or deciduous trees, which are more like these. Plants and animals also have adaptations to their environment. So one example is xerophytic adaptations, which is what desert vegetation do, that they evolved in areas that have a lack of moisture. So they do things like probe deeply to reach the water table, or store water in the plant themselves. Sometimes they're scattered about with a lot of distance in between them, so that they don't have to share water with their neighbors, and so on. These are examples of xerophytic adaptations. And in some places, it's not the lack of water, but it's the excess of water. So you also have hygrophytic or hydrophytic adaptations for wetland plants that have to survive in either seasonally wet or consistently wet conditions. Animals as well have adaptations. So for example, desert animals have their own unique adaptations to dry environments, such as migrating with the weather, living underground, only coming out at night. That means you're nocturnal. Or in some cases that they don't drink any freestanding water. So this is a kangaroo rat, and they have special kidneys that allow them to get all of the water that they need from the seeds that they eat from plants. We can divide up fauna, or animal life, in different ways. These are some of the general divisions of animal life. We have invertebrates, which are animals without a backbone, and mostly these are insects. And the ones that we probably think of more as animals are typically vertebrates, and these have different categories: just fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. So for example, mammals are vertebrates that have milk and hair. And we classify things as species. And species is a specific class of plant or animal. So generally speaking, if you can breed with each other, you're the same species. So even though that a lot of dogs look different from each other, the fact that they can successfully breed and have puppies, who themselves can later have puppies, means that they're the same species. And we have what's called a taxonomic way of dividing them up. The kingdom level divides up plants and animals and other things like fungi. So this leopard here is a member of the animal kingdom. It's part of the Chordata phylum, which means that it's a vertebrate. It has a backbone. And among the vertebrates, it's a mammalia, which means it's a mammal. And among the mammals, its order is a carnivora. And so carnivores are meat-eating animals. And among those, it's a member of the Felidae, or cat family. And of the cats, it's a member of the panther family. And then you have this specific species name, which is a combination of the genus and a second name. So this is called a Panthera pardus. That's what we call a binomial system of naming. It has two names, one of the genus, one of the species. Another aspect to species is we can look at endemic versus exotic species. Endemic species evolved in a place. So California has a number of endemic species that have evolved in California, and some that have been introduced, they've been brought from other places. And oftentimes, exotic species that are brought in from other places can impact or displace endemic species. One other thing about species is that the way that, just a little bit about evolution, that species also have roles in their environment, that they have either very specialized or general existence. So for example, this is the Valley elderberry longhorn beetle, which lives a very specialized existence, living only on elderberry plants. If there's no elderberry plants, no beetle. This, on the other hand, is a coyote, and coyotes can live in all kinds of different environments and all kinds of different circumstances. So the beetle would be considered a specialist, the coyote would be considered a generalist. That's an example of their role in the environment. Another example might be a top-level predator or a herbivore, just different ways that you sort of make a living as an animal or a plant. Species also have habitats. These are the places that they can live, that they have the physical environments that they can tolerate, and that provide them evolution works is that species have evolved to fill different ecological niches. So for example, from some far back common ancestor millions of years ago, we have separations where species have separated to either fill a different role in the environment or a different habitat. And that means they can fill a different ecological niche. So from some common ancestor, let's say back here for this yellow line, we have the evolution of different fishes up to salmon. And then on this different path, you had evolution of all the way to people. So people and salmon had a common ancestor sometime way back, but through these different splitting and changes, you had speciation, all these different types of living things.